Hello everyone, welcome to Keen here. So this is it. This is part one of a series tackling a subject I've wanted to talk about at this level of detail anyway for quite a long time, longer than any other subject, quite honestly. And I originally intended this to be just one video. It would have been a very long video, I'd imagine. I've decided, for the sake of lots of reasons really, which I'm not going to go into, but I've decided to break it up into parts. And this will be part one, of course, where I'm going to be covering the bottom 10 albums. I'm not sure how many I'm going to be covering in future videos. I might increase it, I might decrease it. We'll wait and see. We'll see how it pans out. But this part is going to be the bottom 10. And before I begin, there's just a few little bits and pieces that I need to talk about. First and foremost, this is just going to be 45 in total, not just in this video, but it's going to be 45 in total albums covered. Now, Beatles nerds out there, alarms will be ringing. They'll be thinking, there's a lot more than 45 albums by, former Beatles. And yeah, yes, there is. That's completely right. You are right. Where I'm only going to be covering certain albums, and the albums I'm going to be covering are thus. Uh, well, I should really say are not thus, because these are the albums I'm going to be cutting from the list. First and foremost, Ringo Starr albums. Now, I've got nothing against Ringo whatsoever, but quite honestly, I'm not that interested, greatly interested in his music, outside of the Beatles. Ringo was one of the main reasons, in his albums, was one of the main reasons why this video kind of never came about much sooner, quite honestly, because it was a big hurdle to get over. And in the end, I decided rather than getting over that big hurdle, I'll just bypass it and not bother, quite honestly. So, uh, in these videos, we're only going to be taking a look at two of his studio albums, and that's kind of it. We're going to be ignoring everything else. Maybe in the future, I can sort of incorporate more Ringo albums into, make an update video, an update video of this. But at this point in time, we're just going to have two Ringo albums. So also out of the equation is any album which is not a rock or pop album. So something like this, for instance, which I do have a copy of right here. This is a classical album from Paul. I'm not going to be including anything kind of like that. Anything in regards to like experimental albums, the ones that George made and John and Yoko and all that. I don't actually have those albums anyway, but even if I did, I wouldn't be including it. So it rock and pop only. So they're not being included. Quite honestly, there's more than enough rock and pop albums to cover, really. In these series of videos. Also, as well, I've decided there is a rock and pop album, or album, should I say, the Travel and Wilburys. Decided not to include these because I don't really consider them to be solo Beatles material. I consider them as much Tom Petty or Bob Dylan or Jeff Lynne or etc. albums as they do to be George Harrison. I don't consider them to be true, George Harrison albums in a sense, really. Maybe if I do like a part two of this sometime in the future, who knows if that will ever be, but I might include the Travel and Wilburys and maybe include some of the experimental, maybe some of the Ringo albums, but we'll wait and see. Another album I've decided to not include, I don't actually have a copy of it, but I have listened to it. It's a John Lennon album called Milk and Honey, I believe. It was released after he was murdered, and I've decided not to include it because I've had lots of opportunities to buy it over the years, of course, but I've decided not to include it because I don't consider it to be a proper studio album. I consider it to be really nothing more than a bonus disc that should have been included in like a deluxe edition of the Double Fantasy album, like a re-release of that maybe with like an extra disc. I don't consider it to have enough material, quite honestly, to be, even though the material on it is actually pretty good, bits and pieces of it are pretty good. It's not enough for a proper studio album, so I don't consider that to be a proper album. But again, I could include it in maybe part two of this, if that ever happens, of course. But anyway, they're the only albums I'm going to be missing out. So Ringo, experimental albums, non-rock and pop albums, that kind of thing. Travel and Wilburys, Milk and Honey. So we've got most of the stuff there, quite honestly. We're almost there. We've got more in there than we haven't got, quite honestly. So I figured this is a good time to cover this subject. So anyway, we'll begin at the bottom. and it's there's 45 albums in total. So this is album number 45, and I have included post-it notes on these albums because when I originally intended to do this, I was going to do it all in one shot. And if you've never made a video like this, where you go and ranking albums, or you're just talking about a bunch of albums in any kind of sequence, you'd be amazed how incredibly difficult it is to keep tabs on the sequence you're up to while you're doing it. It's incredibly difficult. But anyway, and I stole this idea from Richard McCook, putting post-it notes on. So thank you, Richard, if you're watching. I stole your idea. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure if you came up with it. Maybe you should have painted it, gone to the patent office. But anyway, this is the first album we're going to be covering, number 45. It's a John Lennon album, and it's John and Yoko album, should I say, and it's sometime in New York City, and it was released in 1972. And this is another thing that I've stolen off Richard McCook to a certain degree when I talk about chart positions, whenever I can. So this got to number 11 in the UK, I believe, and it got to 48 in the US. Now, just one little thing on the US charts. I've tried to stick to like the Billboard charts. In America, it's kind of confusing because they have different charts. And I looked on Wikipedia and there's like all these different charts, different figures and all that kind of thing. They've got different, it's more complicated than America effectively. So I'm just going to stick to the Billboard one. So if you see anything in the future videos, it's the Billboard one. So don't kind of complain if it's a bit wrong or whatever. This is the best I can do, the best information Wikipedia can provide. But anyway, Sometime in New York City, my least favorite studio album by a former Beatle. The reason why I put this at the bottom is because I consider this to be just a massively disappointing album. I consider this to, in fact, to be one of the most disappointing albums ever released, just generally, really, regardless of it being a Beatles related one or whether it just being, a non-Beatles one, quite honestly, whether or not that's the case. It's just such a disappointing album. This came out after, Imagine and Plastic Ono Band, more of those albums, in the future, of course. But this is almost like John's difficult third album. I know it's not technically his third album or anything like that, but I kind of look at this almost as it's John's difficult third album. It really is. Now, I will give this album some credit, and it's the only credit I'm kind of going to be giving it, really. I feel like they tried to do something a little bit different with this album. They didn't just think, oh, we'll just make Imagine 2 or what, if only, quite honestly. But, they tried to do something a little bit different, and it just didn't really work. I think there was supposed to be like a degree of spontaneousness to this album. I guess it was, supposed to be like a time and a place, a point in time and a point, and a point in a, geographical location, in this case, New York. It's supposed to have, I guess, a certain degree of energy to it. You've got the newspaper cover, time and a place. The fact that the album, half of it anyway, is live, again, a time and a place. The songs are mostly based around newspaper reports and that kind of, again, newspaper. Again, it's a time and a place. It's all about a moment in time, and I guess they were trying to capture the particular moments in time, and like a time capsule, in very, in many ways, and kind of release it onto the. It just doesn't really work. It comes across as lazy, half baked, half finished. Just not a great album, really, and it's just very, very disappointing. Now, there is a few songs on here which I think are pretty good. I'm going to try and find the good songs, even in the bad. I'm going to kind of talk about some of the plus points of songs, of every album that I kind of like. And in this case, there's a song called New York City, which is a pretty good song. Many consider it to be a sequel to The Ballad of John and Yoko, which is a very late Beatles song. And yeah, it is kind of similar. There's definitely similarities between the two of them. And it's not a great song, but it's pretty good. It's definitely the highlight on this album. And another good song on here that I think is pretty decent is on the live record. There's the song Cold Turkey, which I think is a pretty good live version of Cold Turkey, which isn't a great song, quite honestly, but it's quite a good version. But everything else I can quite happily never listen to again. So it's like two good songs on a double album. That's a pretty bad hit to miss ratio in total. And yeah, just kind of very, very disappointing all around, really. Now, before I move on, There's just a disclaimer that I want to put at the end. I haven't put this at the bottom because of the political views of that, they're expressed in this. This is a very political album. It's probably one of the most political albums ever released by a major recording artist. And I have no problem with, anyone expressing their political views if they feel they must. But I feel like in this case, it was at the sacrifice of good music. You can make a song about almost anything really to a degree. If the music's great, it's fine. But in this case, it's not. The music is the big letdown, quite honestly. And also as well, I haven't put this at the bottom because it's of Yoko Ono. The Yoko Ono element to this album, because generally what I'm going to try and do is ignore the non-Beatles, non-Beatles contribution to a certain degree anyway, and just focus on the actual Beatle itself on any given album. And and even taking it on board, it's not like all of John's stuff on this album is great and Yoko ruins it. It's not the case at all. John's stuff on this is just as bad. Maybe you could argue is worse than some of the stuff that Yoko produced, which is kind of unforgivable, really. But anyway, that's my least favorite studio album. And I'm probably gonna offload quite a few of these. In terms of the albums at the bottom, I've kept hold of for so long. In terms of that one anyway, because I wanted to make this video. Now I finally kind of I've got no real excuse to keep hold of it, so I can kind of maybe let some of these go. This I haven't had for very long. This is number 44, and it's press to play. It came out originally in 1986. Got to number 8 in the UK, which isn't bad. It got to number 30 in the US. Maybe they listened to the critics in America, and yeah, it's a fairly lousy album, quite honestly. One of the big differences between John and Paul is, there's so many connections between the two, of course. And I think one of the big ones in terms of this period we're talking about, is that both of them incorporated their wives into their music. With Paul it was Linda, of course, and with John it was Yoko. Neither of them were musicians, and I always thought that was a curious connection that both of them had after the Beatles broke up. But anyway, one of the big differences is that John released his worst album in the early 70s, and Paul waited until the 80s to get his one out in 1986. And yeah, this is just a bit of a lame duck of an album. I think this is from a period where Paul just wasn't really sure of himself. I think he was a bit sort of, he was sort of playing catch up to a certain degree. I think he was clinging to some degree of sort of relevance. I think the relevance was starting to slip at this point, and he was just kind of struggling to keep up. Really, I think you got the three big pop titans from America. From the 1980s, you've got Madonna, you've got Michael Jackson, and you've got Prince. And I think Paul at this point in time was just struggling to keep up with the likes of them, and I feel like at this point he was just fighting a losing battle, and he was just kind of not really firing on all cylinders, quite honestly, with this. I believe this album, when it was getting produced, Paul had an idea of what kind of direction it should take, and then kind of he had a producer, and then he flipped. Yeah, he completely reversed, backtracked on the idea and went with somebody else and changed the whole concept. And I just get the impression he just wasn't really sure of himself at this point in time, and it kind of really comes across in this album. Now there is some decent stuff on here with, nothing really more than that. Quite honestly, nothing more than decent. But there's a song on here called "Move Over Busker," which is okay. It's almost like a song that Paul might give Ringo, for one of Ringo's albums. And there's a song as well on here called "Angry," which is okay as well. But everything else is a bit of a lame duck, quite honestly. I think this is some of Paul's worst songwriting. I do quite like the the opening track as well, which is Stranglehold's pretty good, and I think Press as well. The song Press is okay, but it's kind of, there's not really much on here at all, which it really stands out. And the songwriting, it kind of feels like at times that Paul was using like a random word generator to come up with the lyrics. you know, as he's singing along, it's like, where does he get that kind of? I mean, he's one of the greatest songwriters of all time, that's ever lived, ever, created anything, it's ever recorded any music or written any lyrics or anything. And yeah, he's coming up with some of his worst material here. So yeah, a low point for Paul, unfortunately. And it's my second least favourite studio album by a former Beatle. I'll put that there before it falls and breaks. So we'll move on to number 43, and we'll finally get to a Ringo album. I'm kind of glad that I didn't put Ringo albums right at the bottom, but again, this isn't a complete, a complete collection. So maybe things would have been different if it did happen to be, a complete thorough run through everything. But we finally got to Ringo at number 43, and I'm including this one. This is Goodnight Vienna, and this came out originally in 1974, I believe, and in the UK it got to number 30, and in the US it got to number 8. So yeah, kind of a little bit more successful in the States. And yeah, this is the second album I picked up from Ringo. This was like this, regarded by many as the second best studio album by the fans anyway. And I kind of got my hands on this and listened to it, and I thought, well, if this is the second best studio album by Ringo, I kind of don't really want to listen to anymore, quite honestly. Because, not that this is terrible. I'd much rather listen to this than Sometime in New York City, put it that way. But it's still not really a brilliant album. It's beautifully produced, I will say that. It's a really nice production. Richard Perry, I believe, produced this. Really fantastic production. And you got some, John Lennon song opens the album. I'm not sure if any of the other Beatles helped out on this one, but you got a song at least by John, and it's kind of, it's just not really it's just not really great out. It kind of comes across very much as like a 1970s album from like a comedian almost. It's almost like a comedian who fancies himself as a bit of a musician, which I guess the more cynical people out there might consider that's exactly what Ringo Starr is. But they've kind of put out this kind of silly album to a degree, and it is kind of it's got some decent songs on it here and there. But it's my favorite song on here is actually the No No song, which is just pure kind of comedy, really. And you've got the cover. The cover tells you really all you need to. This is not an album to be taken seriously whatsoever, and it's kind of a bit of a joke album, really. But it's kind of fun in a way. It's fun. It's kind of simple and easy to enjoy. You got a song on here from Elton John, for instance. Snookeroo, and it's kind of is what it is, really. It's a song that you can't really love it, but you can't really hate it either. It's kind of like a naughty dog to a certain degree. It's kind of not great. It kind of misbehaves, but it's kind of a bit too cute to kind of genuinely have any hatred for. I definitely don't hate Goodnight Vienna, and it is what it is, really, in many ways. It's just a fairly unremarkable 1970s album. So we'll move on to number 42, and it's Paul once again, and this is, I'm not sure how you pronounce this in English, but it's known as the Russian album, so I'll regard it as the Russian album. This came out in 1988 in the Soviet Union. This is a bizarre album, really, how this kind of came about. It didn't chart, obviously, because I think it got re-released in time in outside of the Soviet Union. But I don't think even when it got released, it didn't do particularly great. Like I was talking before about Press to Play, this is from the 80s, and this is a strange time for Paul when he kind of wasn't really sure. I think the idea behind this album was it was a way of, it's like a gift from the West to the Soviet Union as a way of kind of, breaking tensions and that kind of thing. And because there was a threat of nuclear war at this point in time, which of course there's always been, unfortunately. But at this point, it really was a big threat, and a lot of people thought that it was the end of the world and all that. And Paul was kind of doing his bit, I guess, with this album. And it was just a bit of goodwill, I guess, more than anything else. And it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of a little bit relevant, that sort of theme now, unfortunately, seem to be heading back to this, nightmare scenario. But this album is effectively a bunch of cover songs. It's all cover songs, rock and roll songs. Paul recorded live in a studio. When I first heard about this album, I thought it was a live album that Paul did in the Soviet Union. It was like a live recording, but it's not. It's a live album in a studio, not in a live a live performance or anything. In terms of a crowd and everything, there's no crowd or anything. It's in the studio, and everything was recorded live. It wasn't recorded with any great degree of a typical. It was recorded effectively like an old-fashioned way of recording music, like they did in like the 50s. And I guess that was to give it a certain degree of energy. I guess it was to maybe cut costs as well. Maybe it was easier and quicker to record it that way. I'm not too sure, but it's got some energy to it. Paul's voice is pretty good. There's some classic songs on here. I think my favourite one is Bring It On Home to Me, which is a nice version of it, but nothing really stands out greatly. It's a bunch of rock and roll standards, really. And it kind of is what it is. Exactly that. A bunch of rock and roll songs for the Soviet Union. I'm not really sure what Paul was thinking of at that time, but he decided to do that. And I guess the intention was there, so you can't criticize him too much. The good intentions. So anyway, we'll move on to that was number 42. We'll move on to number 41. And already we're 20 minutes in. So if this was covering a whole lot, I think this would have been a 70-hour video. But anyway, number 41. This is New, again by Paul McCartney, and this came out in 2013. And in the UK, it got to number 3, and in the US, also got to number 3. And I've actually not written down the song for this that really stands out, because there kind of isn't one really. This is a decent album. The first time I listened to this, I was very kind of underwhelmed. It has grown on me since then. I haven't had it very long, in all honesty, this album, but I don't think I'll ever be overly impressed with this one, quite honestly. I think the big problem with this is that Paul decided to go for a more modern, for 2013 anyway, production, which I guess is still similar to what is being kind of pumped out now. So it's kind of he's kind of morphed into this more modern stuff, which doesn't really work that great, I feel, for Paul's music. I think it's kind of not a good fit for Paul, because one of the great things about Paul at this point in his later stage is that his musicianship is fantastic. He's a great, he has great musicians as well helping him out. This isn't like, a complete solo work like the McCartney projects and that kind of thing. But he always has great musicians on, and there's points when I'm listening to this, for instance, where I hear like a great guitar solo, but it has modern day kind of production techniques to it, which I've noticed listening to, I'm not an expert on modern music or anything. I'm not an expert on any kind of type of music, quite honestly. But I've noticed that in modern music, they don't really allow the instrumentation to kind of speak for itself. They kind of, I don't know whether they worry that the audience will get bored listening to a saxophone solo for too long, or a guitar solo, or anything. So they kind of have it for a bit and it's gone, and that's kind of what this album has. It has at times like a great guitar solo, and you think, oh, this is nice, and then it's gone. It's like, oh, if this was maybe not following the more modern style that Paul intended for it, it would probably be a better album, really. It does have the typical kind of Paul, rock sound, so it's not like it's all modern, very sort of modern pop sounding, where they've abandoned most of the kind of traditional album instruments to a certain degree. But it's still got the foundations there. It's just been mixed a little bit with a modern twist, really. And it's fine. There's nothing on here that I particularly love, but there's nothing on here that I think is offensively bad or anything. To me, it's just a bit of a middle of the road experiment by Paul to see if he can kind of still cut it with modern techniques and that kind of maybe reach out to a younger audience. And you'd be surprised how many young people actually do like the Beatles. This idea that all Beatles fans are pensioners and that kind of thing. It really isn't the case. There is a lot of young Beatles fans out there, and I guess this was a way of kind of Paul reaching out to them a little bit, and kind of making them a bit more interested in his music and that sort of thing. But I personally don't think it's really all that great, but it's not really all that terrible either. It kind of just is what it is. So we'll move on to another Paul album. There's going to be a lot of Paul albums in this because there's so many of them. He dominates the the ratio. But anyway, this is McCartney 3. This is number 40, my number 40. This came out in 2020, so this is the most recent album by a former Beatle that we're going to be covering anyway. I'm not sure if Ringo's released one sooner than that. Anyway, this got to number 1 in the UK, and it got to number 2 in America. And again, I put a line through the part where I should really have a song on here that I particularly like, because unfortunately, like the new album, these are the only 2 albums, by the way, where I've done this. I just can't really think of a particular song on here that really leaps out at me that I think is particularly all that great. It kind of all just comes together in one big pile, really, of just kind of not particularly inspiring songs, quite honestly. So this was recorded during lockdown, or rockdown, as Paul called it, because of course he did. And again, you kind of got to give Paul some respect here. That while the world was potentially ending, he was off, recording an album to kind of hopefully cheer us up a little bit as we potentially all die of a horrible plague. But luckily that didn't pan out. But we still got this kind of out of it, and yeah, it was kind of a perfect time. You could argue for Paul to put this together. He couldn't interact with people because of all the restrictions that were going on. So yeah, Paul to go off in a studio by himself and record all the instruments and put the third part finally to the McCartney project was all fair and all good and everything. But ultimately, I don't feel like this is in terms of the McCartney project, in terms of parts 1 and 2. This kind of doesn't really stand up. I felt like those albums were kind of important for some, they had some importance to them. They had a degree of experimentation. They kind of had something deeper to them. This kind of just comes across as like a few extra tracks from maybe the Egypt Station project, which is, we'll get to that eventually. But this is kind of just a little bit more of the same sort of thing. And nothing really stands out. Nothing's really offensively bad. Nothing really is all that great. It's just perfectly fine, and I don't think it has the depth of McCartney 1, McCartney 2. It's not the experimentation, it's not as interesting. It's just a fairly decent later album from Paul that was released at a difficult time for the whole world, and it's kind of just a little gift from Paul, from that period, and nothing really more. But it's nothing offensively bad. I think the only album that I've really covered so far that I consider to be just not really worth considering whatsoever is the Sometime in New York City album, and potentially bits and pieces from the Press to Play album. But generally, they're not bad albums, quite honestly. They're just not great albums. They're not really the sort of albums you can miss unless you're a kind of a diehard, aficionado collector, much like myself, may I say. But anyway, we'll move on to the next album. This is Kisses on the Bottom, number 39, and this came out in 2012, and in the UK it got to number 3, which is pretty remarkable place for an album such as this, quite honestly. And in America it got to number 5, and I was in 2 minds about ever bothering to pick this up, quite honestly, because it's effectively, more or less anyway, it's a collection of covers and old standards, effectively similar. It's a cover album similar to the Russian album that were featured, but this isn't even rock and roll covers. It's old standards that your grandmother. If John had been alive at this point in time, he'd have considered this to be the ultimate sort of granny music album, because it really is. And I believe there was an album from Ringo, a very early Ringo album, which kind of dealt with this kind of, was it Sentimental Journey or something like that. But this is Paul's attempt really at that, years and years later. I think that was from the early 70s, the Ringo album. But anyway, this is mostly anyway, old standards. And this album surprised me, quite honestly. I thought that I thought that I would buy this, listen to it maybe once or twice, and then just never really bother with it again. But actually do quite like this album. I kind of do have a soft spot for it, and mainly because the production is lovely. It's got really lovely production. Also, the songs, they are timeless. I think they kind of are songs that put a bit of a zing to your step, and a bit of they add a bit of twinkle to your eye and that kind of thing. It is kind of a sweet natured album. These songs were created for people who were living through a lot of the times quite hard times, and difficult times, and they wanted stuff to kind of cheer them up in a certain degree. Although I will say some of these songs I do find kind of a little bit annoying. I do have to kind of skip maybe a couple here and there. But when it kind of hits, it's kind of a very charming album. The only real criticism I have of this is that it is a Paul album, and and Paul at this point in time, you could argue isn't really the best person to cover these songs. You kind of I could think of a lot better musicians in a way. No disrespect to Paul, but his voice, for instance, isn't the best to cover these songs. There's better people out there to cover this kind of material. Who've got a younger voice, who've got a bit more life to the voice. At this point in 2012, Paul's voice wasn't at its absolute best, of course. So there's probably better. You could argue there's better people in the world to cover this type of material than than uh, than Paul, but he gives it a nice sort of sheen, and the production's lovely, obviously, because he can get the best in the business. So it's got its plus side as well, but ultimately it's just a bunch of old songs covered by Paul McCartney. And in terms of my favourite song on here, it's actually the one song that Paul wrote, I believe. I think that's the case anyway. There's a song on here called My Valentine, which is a really, really lovely song that Paul created. I think it's one of his best ballads ever. And it's kind of a bit of a hidden gem, quite honestly, because I think a lot of people just bypassed this album because they found out it was just a bunch of covers. Mostly, I guess a lot of people assume this to be entirely made up of covers. Maybe they just overlooked it and that kind of thing. Maybe just thought it wasn't for them. But it does have My Valentine, which is a truly, truly lovely song. And if you've never listened to it before, it's the one song to kind of give a listen to from this. It's really, really nice. So we'll move on to the next album, which is again from Paul. It's number 38, unless I've messed up the sequences, which wouldn't surprise me. And this is Give My Regards to Broad Street. Came out in 1984, so I'm just reading the notes here. It got to number 1 in the UK, and in America it got to number 21. This is a soundtrack album, and the film itself I have actually seen. I saw it very recently, in fact, like last week I saw it for the first time ever. At least I don't believe I've ever seen it. I don't remember it ever being on TV, or I don't remember ever seeing it on VHS back in the 90s or anything like that. It's a film that completely and utterly slipped me by. I imagine it slipped a lot of people by because it was a flop, I believe, in the box office. I believe as well it is on YouTube. At least it was last week when I watched it. So yeah, if you're curious to check it out, maybe you've never seen it before, it is on YouTube. So maybe watch it before it gets taken down, perhaps. Can't imagine it getting re-released by Paul anytime soon. I believe Paul did actually write the script for it, and yeah, the script's not the best. Apparently, he found out from Steven Spielberg. I believe, I don't know if this is a myth or whatever. We found out from Steven Spielberg that when you write a script, you're supposed to rewrite it and fine tune it and that kind of thing, and do several rewrites. He just wrote it and thought, yeah, that'll do. Kind of like a song. Maybe like he was thinking like script writing is like songwriting. Unfortunately, Paul, it's kind of not. So yeah, the script isn't the best. But in terms of the album, just focus on the album. It's actually not that bad. This comes up time and time again as one of the worst albums by Paul, and it arguably is. But in terms of it being a bad album, it's actually a very good bad album. This it really is. It's kind of really not too bad. You kind of think it would be a lot worse than it actually is. And again, this is from the 80s, so you got Paul looking very confused. This is the decade where, particularly at this point in the decade, he was just not really sure what the hell he was doing, and it kind of really comes across. This is like the ultimate example of he has no idea really at this point what he's doing, what direction he's going to take or anything. He's sort of completely out of it, unfortunately. But this album, it's kind of, in terms of the music on it, it's just a bit of a it's a curious mix of bits and pieces from the past, really. This is one of the only examples I'm aware of, anyway, of a Beatle re-recording their Beatles music in the studio, anyway. Obviously, there's live performances where former Beatles played, uh, Beatles music, a lot of it by Paul, in fact. But this is the only example I'm aware of, anyway, of a Beatle re-recording Beatles music and putting it out. And quite honestly, it's good. He does a good job with it. I believe it is George Martin producing it as well. So he's got George Martin producing. I believe it's got Ringo involved as well. So yeah, it's kind of very good. The only problem with it is that why would you listen to these re-recordings from the 80s when you can listen to the original versions? That's the ultimate problem. But they're not too bad at all. I actually quite like, it's quite a, ultimately this album is a curio. It's nothing more than something for the fanatical Beatles fans to kind of track down. So you got stuff like Yesterday, Here, There and Everywhere. You've got For No One, Eleanor Rigby, The Long and Winding Road, which is a song I never really liked at all, but this has got like a really sweet saxophone on it, and it's kind of very nice indeed. So yeah, in terms of the Beatles songs, Paul re-records very good indeed. There's some more recent ones. There he's done sort of Wing songs and that kind of thing, which again is fine. Silly love songs he covers and things like that. More covers, re-record, should I say, because they are his songs at the end of the day. And what's really curious about this album, though, is that he records or re-records at this point in time fairly new songs. Stuff from the Tug of War album, stuff like Ballroom Dancing. Is it Wonderlust as well was on that album? So yeah, those songs were pretty new at this point. In 1984, Tug of War album was it would be almost like Paul releasing an album now with stuff from McCartney 3 or Egypt Station or something. Just not very old songs at all. So, and they are re-recordings, I believe. It's not like he's just transitioned those songs over to this project. He has actually re-recorded them, and it's. I know this is a soundtrack album. It doesn't necessarily follow the same rules as a regular studio album, but it is curious. It's a curio. This, nothing really more than that. But did well in the charts in the UK anyway. Got to #1, big hit. I believe it's one of the rare examples of a film flopping, but the soundtrack that accompanied it doing really well. And I guess this forced Paul McCartney, out of the world of film production to a certain degree and into the studio. This was kind of cementing his position. Just stay away from films, Paul, and maybe just stick to recording music, because that was the only thing that really people had any real time for. It seems the critics and commercially and everything. That was the clear answer that everybody gave him when he released that onto the world. So anyway, up to number 37, a couple more to go, and we'll leave it for this part. But this is the next album, George Harrison, first appearance by George Harrison, and it's Gon Troppo. This is from 1982, and I believe this didn't chart either in America or in the UK. It was one of the true flop albums, you could say. There's not many of these. Most of these albums do chart, but this is one of the rare examples of a former Beatle album just not finding its feet at all. And I believe at this point in time, George was kind of a bit disillusioned by the music industry. He was a bit tired of it, maybe. I'm not entirely sure what was kind of going through his head at the time. But apparently he didn't promote this album, which is one of the main reasons it flopped, I guess, so badly. It just kind of, and that's kind of unheard of, really, to not go and publicise an album, to tour with it, and go on radio shows and TV shows and all that. He just didn't do any of that. So a strange sort of period, I guess, with his focus being on film production, maybe, because there is a song on here which is called Dream Away, which made its way onto the Time Bandits film, which is arguably one of the best films that his production team as a handmade pictures kind of worked on. And yeah, this is maybe his focus was mainly on that. Also, I get the impression that it's kind of he maybe had his idea, his mind on the nice weather, and enjoying himself. It's got like almost like a sunny day when there's not a care in the world kind of feel to it. I know this is a cassette version, not the best to show the cover, but it's kind of got this sunny day, chilled out, let's have a barbecue sort of feel to it, and not really worry about too much about, the more complicated things in life. And maybe it's just a bit too loose, this album. Maybe his heart just wasn't really on it. He had his mind on films and on his garden and maybe sunny beaches and things like that, rather than producing a good quality album. And in this album, it's not bad. It's got some good stuff on it. Dream Away, for instance, is a really nice pop song, and there's some nice instrumental work on it and here and there. But it is George's weakest album, and I think it's an album that he didn't really have a lot of he didn't have a lot of love for this project. I don't think it's an album he really put a lot of passion into, and it kind of comes across. Or it's perfectly fine. It's nothing bad, or it's nothing really to get excited about or anything like that. And it is probably the one George album which you could maybe bypass unless you want to find a copy going cheap. And I kind of maybe should make it clear at this point in time that this being the first video that George is my favourite Beatle. So yeah, I've tried to be as diplomatic as I can with this ranking series. But yeah, I just want to make it clear that George is my favourite. But this is still not a great album really, and I've put it near the bottom just to be as fair, just to highlight the fact that I am being fair, and I will have George near the bottom half if needs be. So anyway, we'll move on to the next album. We've got an album from John now. This is Rock and Roll. This originally came out in 1975. It got to number 6 in the UK, 6 in America, and yeah, it's again similar to the Russian album, which I've just mentioned not long ago, and again with the kisses on the bottom. This is another sort of covers. I believe this is entirely made up of covers this time around. And it's it's an album that kind of we just had Gon Troppo by George, which is an album that the artists didn't really have their heart in when they were making it. And again, this is the case for John. This was an album where John sort of made out of obligation rather than passion. It's not an album he really wanted to make. It's an album he had to make through legal obligations. I believe he was being sued by is it Chuck Berry's producer, and for the Come Together song, from the Beatles, and he kind of had this on his to-do list, to kind of record certain songs, to kind of just get the lawyers off his back and everything. And I think as well at this point in time he had the mid-70s, he had an obligation to the studios, the studio where he had to release so many albums. So yeah, this was kind of like just getting his work out there while he before he went on his little retirement that he had, for looking after his children, from the mid-70s onwards. And yeah, this was sort of retirement from the music industry, should I say, rather than his retirement from his from his work, because of course raising children isn't exactly the easiest thing in the world, but you kind of know what I mean. In terms of leaving the music industry, you kind of, I guess, he kind of left it in a bit of a bit of good riddance kind of mentality, and it comes across a little bit in this album. Quite honestly, it's sort of like just kind of get this one project out of the way and just kind of, get onto what he wanted to do, which is raise his children at the time, which is fair enough. I don't think anyone can criticize him for that. So yeah, this is an album which I'm not going to go into too much detail about how its production, because there's quite a lot to mention, quite honestly, and it's something that I'd urge anyone who hasn't kind of read up on it to read up on it, because for an album that's just a bunch of cover songs, it's actually really interesting. The story, you could almost make a comical film out of it. All the things, all the escapades, mostly because of this Phil Spector's antics. Is the way that he was, at the time, in particular, he was kind of out of control, really, in the way he was behaving. And it's just kind of very interesting what the things that went on, and there's a lot of booze involved. There's, I guess, a certain degree of drugs involved in the production of this album, and I believe it's recorded in 2 takes, and one of them was kind of just, the earlier one was just kind of like completely out of control, and it's just kind of, it's kind of the most interesting, for such a simplistic album as this, it's the more interesting aspect. I feel like, the stuff that was going on in the background is the main deal with this rather than the actual album. The album itself is kind of simple and straightforward, and isn't really that exciting. It's just the product of kind of anarchy that was going on in the studio and all these like little calamities that were going on. But the album is very nicely put together, and it's also, as well, it's a little bit of an opportunity for John to revisit all this material that kind of made him famous in the early days. The days, the very early days of the Beatles, for instance, and pre-Beatles and that kind of thing. Before the Beatles were the Beatles and everything, with recording rock and roll songs in Hamburg and everything like that, and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of John revisiting all this, for the one last time, as it would ultimately turn out to be. So yeah, it's kind of got that poignancy to that aspect, and also, as well, it's got this feel of like, it's almost like, when I listen to this album, it's almost like if John hadn't have made it as a musician, in such a big way, and was still, he was kind of maybe a bit washed up in the 1970s. The Beatles didn't make anything. They broke up or whatever and flopped, and they weren't as talented ultimately as they were. Almost like an alternate reality, and you can hear, you go to some pub in Liverpool or somewhere, wherever, and you can hear, at 3 o'clock in the morning, someone singing in a club, and it's John Lennon on a piano doing old rock and roll songs that he's been singing now since he was like, a teenager. And it's almost got that sort of feel to it, to a certain degree. He's a little bit drunk, and it's late night and all that. Particularly the last song on here, which I really love the cover. As covers go, this is one of my favorite covers of all time. It's a song called Just Because, and it's the final song on the album. It has this it's almost like John drunk at the end of a gig that he was doing on like a cruise ship almost, and you just come downstairs one night and he's playing in a cruise ship, and it's got this kind of, everyone's a bit drunk, everyone's a bit tired, everyone should have gone to bed 3 hours ago. So it's a bit like me at this point in time making this video, only not so drunk. But it's got that kind of feel to it, and it's kind of got a degree of charm to this album. The booze kind of seeps into this album because, pretty much every song on here, John was under the influence of at least something. So, and that kind of comes across with the album, and I kind of like it for that. But in terms of a great album, this isn't great or anything like that. But it's interesting. It's an interesting piece, and it's the end of something as well. And it's almost like, if it wasn't for the Double Fantasy album, it's almost like John kind of going back to the beginning in a way. He did all these songs years and years ago as a teenager, and he's kind of going back to them again. And I think there's a degree of poignancy to that. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. So anyway, we'll move on to the next album. This is going to be the last one of this video. It's number 35. So we did 45 to 35, and this is Egypt Station by Paul McCartney, and this came out in 2018. And I just want to show you one thing I've noticed about these two covers. I noticed this actually when this came out in 2018, but I'm just kind of showing here how similar Gontropo is to Egypt Station in terms of the covers. It's almost exactly the same to a certain degree. Well, not exactly the same, but there's definite similarities between the two. But anyway, this got to number 3 in the UK, number 1 in America. And this is just a very solid, recent album from Paul. It's kind of in a way similar to the new album. Well, I think it's better. I think he's ditched a lot of the more modern production. Not completely. He's kept some of the modern elements from that, but kind of kept his kind of typical sort of classic rock roots, really. So it's, the typical kind of Paul McCartney rock bands kind of feel, and it's a good compromise. Ultimately, I think this is a better compromise than the new album in terms of that a more modern sort of interface and that kind of thing. A good album, it's solid. It's well put together. It's well produced. There's nothing on here though that I think really ultimately jumps out as as a complete classic. I've got the song on here despite repeated warnings as like a standout track. But even so, I don't think there's anything on here which I think is truly, truly great in terms of any Paul McCartney standards. The thing is with these albums, these later Paul McCartney albums, I just want to kind of fit this in before I forget to mention it, is that, even though these aren't great albums in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the stuff that was being produced at this time, this stuff is like, from 2018, this is probably is one of, if not the best album from 2018. New Album was the best album from that year, and McCartney 3 was one of the best, if not the best album from that year. So yeah, these are still very good albums, but ultimately they're not quite up there with the best of the best sort of thing in terms of former Beatles work, because it's of such a high standard. But this is good. This is just worth checking out if you want a semi decent later Paul McCartney album. But I don't think it's anything kind of really more than that. And yeah, it's an album that I think has good appeal to younger audience as well. He's kind of getting into that young Beatles fan base, which does exist, believe it or not. Don't let the cynics tell you otherwise. I know with some degree of certainty that Beatles fans take they really are of all ages. And it's not just old fogies and that kind of thing. People in the 60s and 70s and all that. There is some teenagers and that kind of thing who do love the Beatles. Teens and 20s and kids and all that kind of thing. So anyway, that's it for part one. I'm so glad I didn't do this in one long video, because I think at this rate, we're only done 10 albums, we're just under an hour. So I think it was the right decision to make. But I'm not too sure when the next part will be, hopefully soon. And maybe I'll incorporate more albums and maybe get through them a little bit quicker. But with this one, I just wanted to kind of get my foot in the door really and lay the foundations for the future videos. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, congratulations. And hopefully I haven't upset too many people. The thing is though, the only album that I kind of say this now, the only album out of these that I genuinely don't really like is Sometime in New York City. That's the only one really that I feel is particularly bad, which is pretty good. Going out to 45 albums, there's just one album that I'm not really that keen on. I think that's a pretty good ratio, quite honestly. So anyway, we'll wrap this up for this part. I'll continue this in part two, and we'll make our way closer to the #1 spot. So thanks for watching, everyone, and goodbye.